So the global economy is on a razor's edge. Even a small shock can trigger an outright recession.
On this edition of Expert Answers, the attention turns to the global economy as we unpack the latest findings from the January 2023 edition of the Global Economic Prospects Report. The main headline, that the global economy is dangerously close to a recession, with global growth sharply declining due to high inflation, deteriorating financial conditions, rising geopolitical tensions, and more. So, what will this mean as we look to the year ahead? Is a global recession imminent? And how can countries overcome these challenges? Well, to answer these questions and more, let's talk to the World Bank's director of the Prospects Group, Ayhan Kose. Well, Ayhan, it's great to have you back on Expert Answers to talk about the global economic prospects. I know we check in with you and your team every January and June as new editions of the report are launched. Tell me, what are the headlines for this year?
This year, the big headline is, unfortunately, once again, the global economy is in a tight spot. We downgraded our global growth forecast. We are not expecting global growth to be around 1.7%. This is like half of almost what we expected 6 months ago. So the global economy is on a razor's edge. Even a small shock can trigger an outright recession.
I want to talk more about a global recession in a minute, but what really struck me this year with this report is the scope of the slowdown, right? The countries, the economies, the people that are affected. The impact seems to be very widespread. Can you talk to me more about that?
Slowdown is a very sharp one, and it is broad-based. Relative to 6 months ago, when we released the global economic prospects in June, we downgraded our forecast for 2023 for around 75% of countries around the world. For advanced economies, we downgraded this year's forecast for almost all of them. For emerging market developing economies, we downgraded for nearly 70% of them. In the case of advanced economies, we are expecting a very deep downturn. So they are going to slow from 2.5% last year to 0.5% this year. This is one of the sharpest slowdowns we have seen over the past 5 decades. And when these types of slowdowns actually take place in advanced economies, they have foreshadowed global recessions. In the US, we are expecting growth to be around 0.5%. This is a very weak number for the US economy. In the euro area, growth will be flat, 0. And of course, that's not a good outcome either. So some people debate whether the US will have a recession, the euro area will have a recession. Actually, whether they will have a recession or not, they will feel it is like a recession. In the case of emerging market developing economies, China is critical, and there is a major COVID outbreak in China that will have in the near term negative effects. And these negative effects will translate into spillovers to the rest of the world. So if you take out China, emerging market developing economies, growth will slow from 3.5% last year to 2.7% this year. In the case of China, we are hoping that growth will be around 4%, but that is still 1 percentage point almost lower than what we expected 6 months ago.
Sure. Let's talk about this a bit more, because of course every forecast carries with it some downside risks, right? That conditions could be worse than expected. You might have new factors come into play that exacerbate the situation. You touched upon this a bit in your previous answer, but how real is the risk of a recession? And do you believe in a so-called soft landing?
So now, 6 months ago, we had a downside scenario. We talked about global economy could slip into a sharp downturn. That scenario has now materialized. So our downside scenario 6 months ago became the baseline scenario for 2023. And global growth is really weak, around 1.7%. This is the lowest growth rate since the early 1990s outside of global recessions. The question is whether there will be a global recession. Now, there is a large menu of risks, and a small shock, materialization of one of these risks, could trigger a global recession. One of these risks is associated with higher interest rates because inflation rates remaining persistently high. We are expecting inflation moderating this year relative to last year, but core inflation might remain elevated, and central banks have to continue increasing interest rates or to keep interest rates at a high level. So nowadays, interest rates around, at the global level, 5%. In the report, we discuss one scenario. If global policy interest rates go up to 6%, we might end up seeing recessions in major economies and, of course, a global recession, meaning that this global growth number I mentioned, 1.7%, could go down to all the way 0.6%. That means, of course, per capita income contracting by about 0.3%, and that is the technical definition of a global recession. And policymakers need to be proactive in an environment with multiple risks. The risk of policy mistakes is also higher.
I have to ask, from what you've just said here, what does this mean for our development goals, for poverty, for inequality in general? Because it doesn't sound good.
That is actually the crux of the argument when we think about poverty, when we think about inequality, when we think about inclusive growth, when we think about, the types of development goals global economy set for itself by 2030. These goals are possible. For us to make meaningful progress in these goals, we need to have sustained, robust growth. 3 years ago, we had a global recession. Global economy contracted because of the pandemic. Now, we are in the midst of a sharp downturn. When you look at during the next 2 years, emerging market developing economies, per capita income in these economies will grow slightly below 3%. That's 1 percentage points lower than what they delivered on average during the previous decade. And we were not happy with that growth performance. So even weaker per capita income growth. In the case of sub-Saharan Africa, which is basically home to 60% of extreme poor, per capita income growth is going to be barely above 1%. What does that mean? That type of growth is far below what is needed to have meaningful reduction in poverty. So with these growth outcomes, it is much more difficult for the global community to make serious, meaningful progress when it comes to development objectives.
So let's talk a bit more about growth. One of the areas that this edition of the report mentions is around investment growth, and you highlight a slowdown in that area. Why is that a problem? Why is it going to be bad if we have poor investment growth?
When you think about the numbers, from 2000 to 2009, investment growth around 9 to 10%. From 2010 to 2019, around, let's say, 5%. So you basically halve the number. During the pandemic, 70% of emerging market developing economies experienced outright investment contractions. So investment growth stopped. Since then, investment has been recovering at a very slow pace. And if you compare it with the 2010s, again, we were not very happy with that performance. It is almost 1/3 slower pace than what we saw after the global financial crisis. So when we look at, the future, this 5% number I mentioned is not going to be with us. We are going to basically see growth numbers, investment growth numbers around 3 to 4%. So when you are not investing sufficiently today, it is difficult to generate potential growth, it is difficult to generate productivity growth, and it's difficult to deliver broader development objectives.
So here's the thing, we're dealing with not just one crisis, but multiple crises here, and they carry with them near-term and medium-term risks. What can countries do to overcome these challenges?
There are policy prescriptions at the global level as well as at the national level. At the national level, policymakers need to take care of their house. They need to make sure their house is in order. So in the context of short-term policies, frameworks, implementation, flexibility are the key words. What do I mean by policy frameworks? We need robust frameworks in the context of fiscal policy, monetary policy, and in the context of course, financial policies. Take, for example, fiscal policy. We need to have very clear debt sustainability metrics. We need to have a medium-term fiscal plan so we have a good idea about our revenues and expenditures. We are, trying to adjust the fiscal policy through this difficult period. The other important issue, of course, implementation. Sometimes policymakers pass laws, they are in the books, but they need to be implemented. And the crisis provides great opportunity to enforce policies. And finally, flexibility of policies, critical. Why? We are already in a tight spot and we have multiple risks confronting the global economy. So it's important to be flexible, resilient, calibrate the policies as the new shocks emerge. At the global level, there is no question what we need to do. We need to collaborate to address these global problems. Of course, that starts with the peace in Europe. We need to basically find ways to work even more aggressively to address the climate change challenge. We need to find ways to address the food insecurity in many countries, and we need to have robust frameworks to have quick and durable solutions in the context of debt-related challenges we have.
So let's talk more about countries in particular, because another part of the edition this year, which I found particularly fascinating, is on the plight of small states. Now, these are countries that have a population of 1.5 million people or less. Tell me more about small states. Why are they significant? What are the issues that they've been facing and might continue to face if their economic situation were to worsen?
Yes, small states are like the canaries in the gold mine, in the sense that they tell us the magnitude of these shocks we are experiencing, consequences of these shocks, and what might happen next. In the report, we are looking at 37 small states. These are emerging market, developing economies. They do not have diversified production bases. They rely on, small number of goods. Most of the time, they rely on tourism. Most of them are small island states. They are quite open to trade, and they, of course, import a lot of energy and food. So what happened during the past 3 years created this perfect storm for these economies, in the sense that during the pandemic, tourism collapsed. Primarily because of that, these economies contracted by about 11% in 2020. And this is, 7 times more than what happened in a typical emerging market developing economy. It is very important to talk about the bigger challenge of climate change in the context of small states. These small states are very vulnerable to climate-related shocks, especially in the context of natural disasters. I mean, we see that the frequency of natural disasters has been increasing over time, and the typical natural disaster shaves off 5% of GDP on average in small states. This is much, much larger than what a typical emerging market developing economy experiences.
You know, so Ayhan, we have unpacked a lot here today, and I know a lot of it has been pretty grim, but in the spirit of the new year, I have to ask, can you give me some good news about the global economy?
Yes, good news are there. First of all, there is greater recognition of the inflation problem. Especially during the past year, major central banks in emerging market developing economies have been acting decisively to get ahead of the inflation problem. 6 months ago, we talked about the threat of stagflation, but the policymakers acted decisively. So we think that inflation will moderate, and that's good news. I think second piece of good news is on the financial stability front. Despite repeated interest rate increases, financial sector has been resilient. This does not necessarily mean that, you know, there are some cracks here and there in the system. We will see this year. Hopefully, there won't be a major crack. And I think the third important news, when we look back 2022, there is greater recognition by the global community the need that there should be larger resources to address the climate change problem. I am not saying that we are making sufficient progress, but we can make no progress if we do not recognize the magnitude of the problem and the magnitude of resources needed to solve that problem. I think we have made good progress last year in terms of acknowledging the problem and acknowledging the need to address this problem. In this context, investment is critical. We raised the issue of investment weakness. Of course, without significant infrastructure investment, we cannot overcome the climate challenge. So it is a dim outlook, but I think there are good reasons to be optimistic, and we should look to the future, stay on course, and on the part of policymakers, deliver what is necessary in a credible fashion.
And perhaps, as you said, you know, not only does it let us look ahead, but these moments really offer up a chance to reflect on what we've been doing.
Indeed.
Well, Ayhan, thank you again so much for joining me on Expert Answers and unpacking some of the findings from this year's Global Economic Prospects Report. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. Several crucial yet sobering messages coming to the fore from our conversation here today. You can, of course, get your very own copy of the Global Economic Prospects Report. It's available now, and it is chock full of analysis and data on the topics that we've touched upon here today. And there is also a special focus in this edition on investment growth prospects post-pandemic, as well as the plight of small states. To get your own copy, head on over to our website, www.worldbank.org/GEP, GEP. That's it for this edition of Expert Answers. We'll see you again next time. Goodbye.